Thank you. I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, and I am a co-chair of the center's working group on Christians and religious pluralism in the Middle East, in which we have been hearing a lot about Egypt, and one of my co-chairs is here with me today, Dr. Elizabeth Perdomo, and I'll introduce her and the others in just a second. I was also with Elizabeth, and as Nadine is, a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for 12 years. I have been doing religious freedom advocacy as a lawyer, a nonprofit lawyer, for over 30 years, and have been at Hudson for almost 15 years doing it. And Egypt has always, well, for at least the last 20 years, been on my radar screen. I want to congratulate Coptic Solidarity. It's very unusual for Middle Eastern Christians to come together year after year and to join forces, to show a united front, and to advocate on behalf of the situation of Christians in the Middle East. Certainly the Copts, the faithfulness of the Copts, country of martyrs, you call yourselves, has been a great inspiration to believers all over the world, particularly us Christians in the West. But it's also very admirable what you have done for a decade now to come together to highlight the issues, to raise awareness, and to push for reform back in Egypt. 10 years ago, when you were founded, and again, really I give a tribute to the founders of Coptic Solidarity, to the board members, to the staff, and to the members. I really want to thank Caroline Dose and Magdi Khalil and Lindsay Vesey for bringing this together, Dr. Risk today, all of you. 10 years ago, that was before Maspero, about 2 years before Maspero massacre, which Copts were demonstrating against the burning and attacks on their churches and asking for justice, and they were murdered in the streets by the Egyptian military. It was before the so-called Arab Spring, when scores of churches were attacked, damaged, and some ruined. It was before the 21 martyrs. It was before ISIS announced itself in Egypt and declared on a video that Copts were its favorite prey, Coptic Christians, that is. It was before the bombings of churches on Palm Sunday and Christmas. It was before the attack on St. Mark's, the papal compound. And it was before the two attacks now, on the pilgrims going to St. Samuel the Confessor's Monastery. I had the interesting experience, eye-opening experience of traveling to Egypt for the first time last October. There it really came across to me that that there's two things going on. There are attacks by ISIS against the churches, which President Sisi seems to want to stop and offer some protection for and some justice for. And then there's the attacks by the neighbors of the churches. And there have been, according to some calculations, Sam Tadros works with me at Hudson. He's a wonderful Coptic analyst of the situation. 500 church attacks in Egypt in the last couple years. These attacks are without any kind of justice, without really any type of protection. Sometimes the police join in on the attacks. And these attacks are not are done in a climate of impunity because the government does not fulfill its most important role, and that is to protect all of its citizens equally. These attacks are born of an ideology of Islamist supremacy, and the government does not try to change that culture. I was very, very moved when I went to St. Mark's compound, and in the chapel there where there was the bombing, I saw a poster. And the cops, that's one of the things I really admire about the cops. They do honor their martyrs. It was very jarring to see, though, the faces of these 22 women and girls, very modern-looking faces and hairdos, with digitally imposed crowns of martyrdom on top of their heads. It was an extremely jarring and moving experience for me. I also looked in preparation for this in the State Department country report on Egypt on religious freedom. And I imagine you're all familiar with those reports that come out annually by the State Department. In fact, Ambassador Brownback is in charge of putting those together. For 2009, the year you were founded, the very first, my sign is not wanting to stay up here. Well, you know who I am. No, I'm sorry about this. Okay, thank you. So the 2009 report, which I checked in preparation for this conference, amazingly enough, it's unsurprisingly actually, started talking immediately about the fact that there were attacks on churches and cops with impunity, that there was a reconciliation session. This was highlighted in the State Department country report for Egypt 10 years ago. It's still a problem. They make the point, if you have reconciliation, no justice, you're going to have a climate of impunity, and it's going to happen again and again and again. And as Caroline mentioned, it is happening still now. Their recent case is a case in point, and that was the violent celebration of a marriage, an illicit marriage of a Christian woman who was already married to a Christian man, to a Muslim, and without getting a divorce. The government approved this. In other words, it's a case of, bigamy, basically, and in celebration of this crossover to Islam by the woman, the police shot up the Christian town and shot up the Christian houses. So again, there was no justice in the case. There was no divorce in the case. There was no accountability for the police who used violence to celebrate this, glorious event for Islam, I guess. Also recent blasphemy cases. So you still have a lot of work to do. I congratulate you for this milestone of 10 years, and I wish you every success in the next 10 years. Unfortunately, your work is very, very much needed, and I want to let you know that I stand in solidarity with you and will be working on Egypt as well. It's now my honor to introduce this distinguished panel. I'm going to introduce them all right now, and then ask them to come up to the podium, if that's okay with you, or you can stay here. They will each have 10 or 15 minutes, and then I want to have ample time for your questions and for discussion among them. So the first speaker is Nadine Manza, who was appointed by President Donald Trump to the Commission for International Religious Freedom in May last year. Nadine is a noted speaker, writer, and policy expert with more than 2 decades of experience as an advocate for working families and a champion for international religious freedom. She recently represented the Commission in Saudi Arabia for a groundbreaking meeting with their religious police. She is most honored to have met with persecuted communities of various faiths from some of the most repressive countries in the world. And USERF, as you know, that's what we call the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. USERF is an independent government agency. and it has been 20 years since Congress established it. It is bipartisan and multi-faith, so it's really, I think, a good model for a lot of other countries, and some other countries are adopting it.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me join you on this important 10th anniversary, and congratulations, Jen, and all of you, Elizabeth. As many of you know today, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has long followed the challenging circumstances of the Coptic and other religious minority communities in Egypt. Since the very earliest days of the Commission, which both Nina and Elizabeth can attest, have a long institutional history of supporting efforts to fulfill the Coptic community's collective yearning to achieve and truly experience the full rights and freedoms that they deserve as Egyptian citizens. They are, after all, members of a community with deep and ancient roots in the country's heritage, but one that also continues to play an integral and indivisible role in the contemporary Egyptian life. We stand at a potentially pivotal moment in the history and experience of the Copts, one that is fraught with the contradictions of hope and despair, progress and regress, rhetoric and reality. On one hand, it is encouraging to hear the recent shift in public discourse towards religious inclusion and tolerance from Egypt's highest levels of leadership, exemplified by President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's comments earlier this month, in which he encouraged Egyptian Muslims to abandon their prejudice against Christians, and in his words, respond to Christian celebrations by taking joy in their joy. These words are perhaps only symbolic, but they do matter nonetheless. After all, these admonitions of the Egyptian Muslims to treat their Christian neighbors better with tolerance and respect stand in clear contrast to the Mubarak era, in which the former president dealt with challenges facing the Copts by simply ignoring or denying that such challenges existed in the first place. On the other hand, it is equally clear that this shift in tone from national leadership has yet to impact the lives of the average Egyptian Christian, particularly in those rural areas, and the realities of daily life are far removed from the optimism of the president. In those areas, old prejudices and bigotries remain deeply rooted, and sometimes they spill over from passive discrimination into open violence. It is in one sense easy to open the largest cathedral in the Middle East that I was privileged to attend in January in Cairo, where few people live yet old sectarian patterns have yet to emerge. It is far more difficult, complicated, and risky to convince or force villagers in Samalut or Sultan Pasha or Amenable to allow their Christian neighbors to worship, congregate, or openly express their faith. It is in this context that I turn to the session's specific theme, reducing institutional discrimination in Egypt. Discrimination is unlike more overt forms of violent persecution, such as the horrific bus attacks that both Carrie and Nina referred to that were carried out by ISIS against Coptic pilgrims in 2017 and 18, or the burning of dozens of churches across the country by fanatic supporters of the formerly deposed president and Muslim Brotherhood member Mohammed Morsi in 2013. This sort of intolerance casts a wider net of bloodlust, of course. The same radical Islamist violence that has targeted the Coptic community also sets its sights on Sufi Muslims in the Rada Mosque of Al Arish in North Sinai in November of 2017, killing over 300 people. This sort of violent bigotry threatens all of Egypt's society, Christians and Muslims alike. However, religious discrimination is a different phenomenon. It is perhaps less deadly, but far more pervasive than the violence of ISIS and its ideological partners. It is by nature systemic, widespread, and perhaps most insinuously, it hides in plain sight in some of the country's very institutions. It hides in the country's new committee to combat sectarianism, formed to great government fanfare in December of 2018, while failing to include even a single Coptic representation. It hides in the passivity of security forces when they deploy in response to mob attacks against Christian homes and churches, but then stand up and allow the violence to unfold instead of doing their jobs by stepping in and preventing it. It hides in the same security forces' arrests of Copts themselves who suffered in these attacks in the name of public order. And sometimes it even hides in the direct collusion in sectarian incidents, such as the events that unfolded in the village of Ali Pasha near Samalut just last week. And discrimination hides in the traditional reconciliation councils that follow all such mob attacks in Upper Egypt, the Nile Delta, and elsewhere. Councils that appear on the surface to promote peace and conflict resolution, but in reality only serve to punish the Coptic victims of the mob violence and absolve all legal accountability of their neighbors who threatened them, and even the imams that incited the crowds against them. This kind of discrimination fosters a culture of impunity that is still pervasive in Upper Egypt. Finally, we are here this morning to not simply air grievances among ourselves or to preach to the choir. We're here to discuss what it might mean to bring about a real and lasting reduction of the institutionalized discrimination that has so long plagued the Coptic community and other religious minorities in Egypt. In our recently released annual report, we made several recommendations to the U.S. government that, among other issues, directly apply to the efforts to reduce institutional and societal discrimination. We urge the U.S. government to take every opportunity to press their counterparts in the Egyptian government to end the practice of circumventing justice by deferring to so-called customary reconciliation councils in order to deal with these incidents of violence. If Egypt wants to uphold any sort of sense of abiding by rule of law, then it can no longer actively or passively allow these councils to stand in the way of justice. Secondly, we recommend that the United States urge the Egyptian government to expedite the approval of registration for churches and church-related buildings under the 2016 law, but also to enforce the own provision that says churches awaiting approval should be able to continue to practice. This 2016 law should be understood merely as a stepping stone in a larger process of dialogue and negotiation, with the end goal of one day passing a law that would uniformly apply to the construction, renovation, and administration of all houses of worship for Christian, Muslims, and all who call Egypt home. Third, we recommend that the United States continue to urge Egypt to repeal or revise Article 98F of the Penal Code, which criminalizes so-called blasphemy or contempt of religion. As we've seen repeated in other countries as well, this law, which the Egyptian government touts as a safeguard of mutual respect and public order, is in fact wielded against universally as a bludgeon of oppression. It's wielded against women, dissidents, atheists, practically Muslims whose individual convictions may clash with those of the norms. It is also quite often used against Coptic Christians who are perceived as stepping out of the religious pecking order, such as Abdu Adol of Minbal, Minya, whose Facebook post in 2018 reportedly compared the Prophet Muhammad to Jesus. It first led to a mob attack against local Copts, then his arrest and eventual sentencing to 3 years in prison. His incarceration is in a dismal prison in the New Valley Governorate, far from his family and community in Minbal, represents the true repressive and bitter fruit of this anti-blasphemy law. Finally, we recommend that U.S. officials encourage Egypt to uphold Article 53 of its own constitution by providing true equality for all of its citizens, Copts and Muslims alike. Part of fulfilling that mandate should include forming an independent anti-discrimination body that represents and advocates for all Egyptians, not just the religious and societal rights of the Sunni Muslim majority. It should also include all those communities who might otherwise fall between the cracks of Egyptian state and society, whether Baha'is, Shia Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, or those who choose to believe nothing at all. Egypt must have religious freedom for all, or it will have it for none. At a time in which Egypt's leadership has adopted a new discourse of tolerance and an openness to broadening freedom of religion or belief, it is crucial that such words also translate into real action, into transformative policy, and into an actual improvement in the lives of all of Egypt's citizens. From the shores of the Mediterranean Sea to the north, to those of Lake Nasser in the south. And then and only then can we take that renewed discourse at its word. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers of this event, to the leadership of Coptic Solidarity for inviting us to be here today. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. Some of what I'll say has been already repeated, has already been addressed by our previous speakers, but I think reiteration is worthwhile for a variety of reasons. I think if we take a broad step back and look at the post-Cold War period, the period after the Cold War, the international order has seen a marked, measurable increase in violence in the name of religion around the world. The perpetrators of that kind of violence are both states and non-state actors, and that violence is very frequently targeted at specific religious communities, at their members, their leaders, their lay and ordained leaders, intellectuals, teachers, business people, philanthropists, the elderly, youth. That kind of violence is targeted at their properties, personal and communal. And that sort of violence is also targeted at their cultural and religious heritage sites. Now, these kinds of behaviors of punctuated and regular violence, cleansing, pogroms, genocide, fall under the category of persecution. And rightly so, they receive a good deal of media attention and policy talk, not necessarily always policy action, but policy talk. Because persecution of religious communities, let's make no mistake, my friends, is designed to eliminate, terminate, and eradicate those communities. But there's another type of assault on religious communities that has equally lethal, fatal results, but it draws far less media coverage and equally damaging, far less policy attention and constructive action. And that's the type of assault that falls under the category of religious discrimination or institutionalized discrimination. And for Coptic Orthodox Christians, both persecution and discrimination are unfortunately a well-known experience. And I would argue that institutionalized discrimination is the dominant reality of the Copts of Egypt. And in this, there's a broader message and a set of policy prescriptions to be had, and I will try to address some policy recommendations at the end, as the previous speaker did as well. And I would also underscore that in the Egyptian case, the Coptic Orthodox are the largest and most visible example of laws and practices that also affect Baha'is, Jews, Nubians, Bedouins, and non-conforming Muslims. So the Coptic community is an example of a kind of institutionalized discrimination that affects all vulnerable communities in Egypt. I also took notice as I was preparing my remarks today, I took notice of the fact today that June 20th is Juneteenth, known as Juneteenth Independence Day. And that is the date that we commemorate for the emancipation of enslaved African Americans throughout the Confederate States of the United States. And I emphasize this because although Juneteenth formally ended slavery in the United States, it certainly didn't end institutionalized discrimination, which we came to know as the Jim Crow laws. Those laws were instituted throughout the remainder of the 19th and early 20th century, and ultimately only fully abolished in the 1960s. And I mention that because that status of separate and unequal that is part of the history that we're remembering with Juneteenth is exactly the kind of status that Coptic Orthodox Christians, and more generally Christians across the greater Middle East, but vulnerable religious communities in the region and worldwide, are subjected to. As the previous speaker said, that kind of institutionalized discrimination, it has a pernicious effect on the sustainability, the vitality, and ultimately the living survival of those communities. And that's the case for Copts in Egypt, as all of you well know. So I want to say a little bit about three types of institutionalized discrimination that particularly affect Coptic Christians by endangering their physical security, by marginalizing them to second-class status in their land of origin, and by gradually erasing the physical evidence of their 2,000-year presence in Egypt. Or 2,000 minus 33, whatever that is. I'm bad at math, so 2,000 years. The first kind of institutionalized discrimination occurs in terms of social relations. We all remember the highly mediatized, tragic, and graphic case of the 72-year-old Coptic Egyptian woman. She was stripped naked and dragged through the streets in the Minya Governorate. And that case, graphic and ugly and tragic, was emblematic, I think, of the social discrimination that is faced by Copts on a daily basis. The assault itself was accompanied by the looting and burning of 7 Christian homes. It was also highlighted the fact that women in particular, as a subset or members of the Coptic community are particularly vulnerable and subjected to institutionalized discrimination in terms of social relations in broader Egyptian society. That woman had been attacked because of a false rumor about her son having an affair with a Muslim woman. But we see throughout Egypt, case after case, where Coptic women are subject to regular harassment in the streets, to kidnapping, and to forced conversions to Islam if they're dating Muslim men. There's oftentimes mob retribution taken against the woman's family if the family protests. And as we heard as well, the judicial system is highly biased and inefficient. Police and judicial protections are lacking. Investigations into reported abductions and forced conversions are rare, pro forma, and sloppy. And the informal reconciliation sessions that pass for local justice, they're heavily weighted against the perpetrator and against the Muslim majority, and in favor of the Muslim majority population, and subject the victim and her family to greater vulnerability. So that kind of social discrimination, institutionalized discrimination in terms of the most fundamental of social relationships is pervasive in Egypt. And because Article 2 of the current and the new draft Egyptian constitution identifies Islamic Sharia as the main source of legislation in the country, social relations and what I'm about to talk about now, employment practices, are by their very nature discriminatory against Copts, other non-Muslims, and against non-conforming Muslims. The second kind of institutionalized discrimination that I would like to discuss is employment practices. Egypt's October 2019 civil service law allows Muslims 1 month of paid leave to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. But there are no similar provisions for Christians who may want to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So here's an example in terms of employment law, where we see institutionalized, legalized discrimination in favor of one community and against another. Anecdotal but very frequent reporting also suggests that businesses oftentimes announce that they will only hire workers who know the Quran by heart. That effectively prohibits then Christians from applying for a job. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And the discrimination in the employment sector ultimately goes back to the question of identity cards and putting religion on the identity cards, which produces a whole host of discriminatory practices when it comes to hiring, firing, and the conditions under which people work. If Coptic Christians aren't given the opportunity to achieve the highest levels of leadership positions in their own fields, then there are two options for them. Continue to live as separate and unequal, facing institutionalized discrimination and economic and social marginalization, or leave. And so these are the options that are quite deliberately constructed in order to make it impossible for the community to sustain itself with vitality and even to remain inside Egypt. The third kind of institutionalized discrimination that I wanted to highlight concerns something, again, we've heard about and we read about all the time, and that is the desecrations, burnings, lootings of Coptic churches, but also cultural sites and even cemeteries. The perpetrators of these kinds of attacks are rarely brought to justice, and if they are prosecuted, they're almost always acquitted. So the judicial system itself sends a signal that Copts are alien to Muslim-majority Egypt, and that the erasure of their physical presence, their physical sites, the sites that hold the living community and the historic memory of the community, that those sites and their erasure is to be tolerated and implicitly, if not explicitly, supported. Now, the much ballyhooed and anticipated August 2016 law on the construction and renovation of churches, the church building laws it's called, has been widely and rightly condemned by human rights activists as a sham. The law contains provisions that, quote, allow governors to deny church building permits with no stated way to appeal. The law also requires that church be built, quote, commensurate with the number of Christians in the area. And the law also contains security provisions that risk subjecting decisions. They make decisions on whether or not to allow church construction and repair a question of local and national security. So there's a kind of mob rule underpinning to that logic. Now, we have examples since the passage of the law in August 2016 of its dysfunctionality and discriminatory nature. For example, the governor of the Minya Governorate refuses to issue permits without any explanation for constructing new churches. Coptic Christians in the Red Sea Governorate also report similar problems. And furthermore, going back to this point about the churches can be built commensurate with the number of Christians in the area. Well, for those of us who work on the region and maybe from the region, we know full well that the draining of Christians from the region, which has been the result of this kind of persecution and discrimination, has reduced the numbers to remnants in many cases. So if building of new churches and places of worship, cultural centers, schools, etc., is conditional upon a certain kind of threshold with Christians in the area, as the number of Christians decline, well, wave our magic legal wand and we say, oh, there's no need for a new church or a new school or a new cultural center. So that has had a particularly pernicious effect as well on the implementation of a church building law that was, widely hailed as an improvement in the condition for Coptic Christians in Egypt. Also, it's worth noting that, the parliamentary memo that accompanied this law stated that governors must take into account security and public safety when they make their decision on the construction of new churches. And then finally, it's worth pointing out that 2016 law also contains a Mubarak-era provision that continues to make it impossible to renovate churches. So it's not only about building new churches, it's about renovating old churches. It's about being able to put in a bathroom in the church and not have the local official come down and seize the church property, or a local mob come and break down, destroy that section of the augmentation to the church, so the revision of the church. So this limitation both on construction and maintenance of old churches, as well as the tolerance for mob attack on churches, homes, businesses, desecration of cemeteries, constitutes an effort to erase the living and the historical physical presence of Coptic Orthodox Christians from Egypt. It's a gradualist strategy of memoricide. It's erasing the memory of these people's existence. It's incremental and it's deliberate. So what can we do? To piggyback on some of the previous recommendations, I would begin by saying, unfortunately, in April, the Egyptian parliament approved by a vast majority the proposed constitutional changes that would effectively allow President Sisi to stay in office until 2034. But none of the proposals that I'm going to talk about were included in this new draft constitution. So I don't know if it's too late, but it's worth considering them. First of all, in general, remove all discriminatory provisions in the Constitution, including the restriction of legal recognition to heavenly religions, because there are more than the Abrahamic religions in Egypt. And enforcing and amplifying the religious pluralism that is still present in Egypt is good for all communities, including the Coptic community. And in particular, the provision, the Article 2 provision on Islamic Sharia as the main source of legislation should have been removed. Should have been removed from the draft constitution. Second, I would argue that there should have been a law banning discrimination in line with the existing Article 53 of the Constitution, and that law should meet and comply with international standards. Another recommendation, repeal, not amend, repeal the 2016 church building law and replace it with a unified legal framework for all places of worship. There should be a single set of procedures, a single set of transparent guidelines for the construction, the renovation, the maintenance of all religious and cultural buildings, so that churches and mosques are subject to the same kind of regulations. So these are some of the recommendations that I would make, and as I said, it may be too late because that draft for the new constitution has been passed, but this is where leverage comes into play. And what are the institutional environments that might exert some leverage in defense of ending the institutionalized discrimination against Coptic Orthodox Christians? We talked about the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I know that when we served, one of my sources of frustration, and it remains one, with all of the U.S. government agencies that are committed to supporting international religious freedom, is the lack of appreciation of the lethal, fatal, pernicious effects of institutionalized discrimination. Laws being passed are not enough. I mean, we can go across the region and around the world and see that there may be the best laws on the books. If there's not the political will to enforce those laws, and if there aren't penalties for failure to enforce, then we're facing a farce, adding insult to injury, because there are cosmetic changes which don't produce substantive changes. And I think that's a message for your organization, to emphasize and underscore and make clear the kind of institutionalized discrimination that continues to occur despite being able to point to a constitutional law or provision that would suggest that things should be otherwise. So U.S. government institutions like the USERF, the Office of International Religious Freedom, I think Knox Thames will be here later to speak about the work of the IRF office. I would also urge that the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs can work on these kinds of issues. That is the State Department Bureau that negotiates memoranda of understanding, bilateral memoranda of understanding between the United States and other countries, dealing with the preservation and protection of religious and cultural affairs. It's very important in those kinds of memoranda to be sure to include protections for, in the case of Egypt, Coptic Orthodox sites, historical sites, monuments, etc. And again, it's not just churches or monasteries, it's schools, it's cultural centers, it's cemeteries, it's museums. And then finally, I would urge that the Secretaries of Defense and the Secretaries of State be engaged so that the message is very clear that the protection of human rights, and in this case, ending institutionalized discrimination against Coptic Christians, isn't simply a matter of human rights, which we all should protect, but it's also a security matter, because there's ample data to show that countries that not only tolerate, but that respect and embrace religious pluralism, those are countries that also have high degrees of religious freedom, that in turn then have high degrees of other civil and political liberties that create a stable security environment. So keeping Copts alive and well in Egypt is good not only for human rights, but it's good for the security environment. And those are two sides of the same coin. Human rights and religious freedom on the one hand, and stable security on the other. And and if we now go from a coin to a triangle, the third point on the triangle is economic development. Because again, we know that religious pluralism, and in particular the case of the Coptic Christians, their disproportionate contribution in terms of high levels of literacy, high levels of wealth generation, investment, these are things that are good for Egypt as a whole, and they're good then for the stable security environment in Egypt. So I would suggest working with the basket of international religious freedom institutions that exist, but also going to diplomacy and security in terms of messaging your cause. As my colleague Nina Shea mentioned, we are with you and we're advocating with you and working with you, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Gabriel Sauma. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and my family comes actually from southeast Turkey. I don't know how many of you have read about the massacres of the 1915. My father was born there, and he suffered as a result of that. So my mother was born also in that area. When the French mandate came into existence in 1914, it was like heaven came on earth. So my father was around 13, 14 years old when the French army came to Syria. In this process, he went to Syria and became a member of the French army. He told me that while they were driving into the areas of Syria in trucks that are French trucks that are loaded with the Syrian Orthodox, Assyrians, Chaldeans people, he said the Muslims would throw stones on these buses. And so when the French mandate finished, they were given a chance to either go to France or stay in their place. He said we couldn't stay in Syria because of the discrimination. So they were going to, he said, definitely they were going to kill us. They killed in Turkey 1.5 million Armenians. They killed from our community, Syriacs, Assyrians, Chaldeans, close to 500,000. They destroyed all the churches, very few churches. As you know, Christianity rose in Turkey. Turkey is the cradle of Christianity. That's where the Mother of God was there. St. John wrote his books over there. The seven sleepers are in Turkey. Turkey has a good history of Christianity, but unfortunately now there are 72 million Turks in Turkey. There's less than 1% Christians. So they moved the buses from Syria to Lebanon, so the gathering would have been in Lebanon, and then the ships would take them to France. Upon his arrival in Lebanon, he found a church for our community. He found a bishop, a priest, and so he decided to stay in Lebanon. We were all, my brothers and I, were all born in Lebanon. Lebanon was very good to us. I studied in Lebanon. I became a lawyer in Lebanon. And then in 1975, as you already know, another civil war struck the country, in which more than or close to probably 200, some estimates 250,000 people died during that war. But we managed until a few months later I had to leave. My brothers left earlier than me, and now we live, thank God, in the United States. Now, if I ask every single one of you who came from the Middle East, he would probably have a story similar to this. All of you who came from the Middle East, you came as a result of the persecution that was addressed, that plagued the Christian community in the Middle East. It didn't start in 1975 with the Civil War. It didn't start in 1915 under the Ottoman Empire. It started actually upon the rise of Islam. If you study the history of Islam, you would find that after the death of Muhammad in 632, came the first caliph, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and then came the second one, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Here is what Umar ibn al-Khattab instituted on the Christians of the Middle East. They call it the Pact of Umar. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, this is a letter to the servant of God, Umar ibn al-Khattab, commander of the faithful, from the Christians of this area and that city. When you came against us, the Christians are telling the Caliph, when you came against us, we asked you for a safe conduct. They call it in Arabic, aman. For ourselves and our descendants, our property, and the people of our community. And we undertook the following obligations towards you. Now, we're talking about how you institutionalize the discrimination against people. Here is the first dose of that discrimination. Now, the Christians are promising the Umar, the Caliph, we shall not build in our cities or in their neighborhood new monasteries or churches or covenants or monks' cells, nor shall we repair. This is what's happening in Egypt now. Nor shall we repair by day or by night such of them as fall in ruins, when they get ruined, or are situated in the quarters of the Muslim. The Christians, out of their fear, they took upon themselves not to build monasteries, churches, covenants, and places for worship. Number two, we shall keep our gates wide open for passerby or travelers. You have to keep your door open at night if a Muslim passes by and he feels like sleeping in your home. You have to keep your door open. We shall not give shelter in our churches or in our dwellings to any spy, nor bide him from the Muslims. If you have a Christian coming to hide in a Christian home, you cannot hide him because the government is going to say this guy is a spy, so you are under pressure. We shall not teach the Quran to our children. None of us who were in Lebanon studied the Quran. We didn't have copies of the Quran. Only the Muslims could carry them. We shall not manifest our religion publicly, nor convert anyone to it. So as a Christian, you cannot present your religion in public, and you cannot accept a Muslim coming into your religion. We shall show respect toward the Muslims, and we shall rise from our seats when they wish to sit. We shall not seek to resemble the Muslims by imitating any of their garments. If you are a Christian, you could not wear a garment similar to that of the Muslims. We shall not mount on saddles. If you are a Christian, you cannot ride on your horse. We shall not sell fermented drinks. You cannot have alcoholic drinks. We shall not engrave Arabic inscriptions on our seals. We shall clip the front of our heads. As a Christian, in order to be recognized as a Christian, you have to cut your hair from this side. We shall not display our crosses or our books in the roads. So now you tell me, after all of these, how did this institutionalization came to Egypt? It's all over the Middle East, folks. It's all over the Middle East. Wherever you are, if you are in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Iraq, we had more than 1.5 million Christians when Saddam Hussein was in charge. Now I checked with the bishop of the Chaldean church. He said, we're lucky if we have 250,000 people. Now what happened to all these people? The Islamic discrimination, you cannot describe it unless you live in these countries. Now, in 1948, as you know, the United States and 45 other countries initiated what's known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. those countries who participated in this, and by the way, those who wrote the declaration were Egyptians and Lebanese scholars. Only Saudi Arabia did not sign on this Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration gives you the freedoms that we have here in this country: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of press. All these freedoms were given in the Universal Declaration. The Muslims, years later, did not like this declaration. They said this declaration was done by Christian countries. It represents the Christian ideas, and therefore we need to come up with a new declaration similar to this, but limited to what's known as the Islamic law. So they came up with a declaration, they call it Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights. And this was done by the Islamic, what do you call that Organization of Islamic Conference. Now they changed the name, something like that. Cooperation. It's fascinating when you read this. They had it in two versions, one in Arabic, which is the original, and the other one is in English. So I speak Arabic, I read Arabic. When you read it in the English version, it's fine. It's exactly similar to the Universal Declaration. We have the freedom of press, we have freedom of religion, we have freedom of expression. All these freedoms that are listed under the Declaration, Universal Declaration, they are listed under the Islamic Declaration. But there is a word added to that. We respect, or we guarantee freedom of religion within the law, capital L. We respect the freedom of expression within the law, the freedom of movement within the law. They don't tell you what law. Now, you bring the Arabic copy, and it's very clear. Within the Islamic law, the Sharia law, which is based on the Quran and the Hadith. I think most of you who lived in the Middle East understand what Islamic Sharia is. I deal with cases here in the United States as expert consultant on Islamic marriage, Islamic divorce, custody, abduction of children, all of these things. And I have done hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of cases throughout the nation on these things. There is a pluralistic practice of Islam in the United States and in Europe. For example, a Muslim man would marry a Christian woman, and then he would ask her to have an Islamic marriage. You wouldn't see, for example, a Muslim woman marry a non-Muslim person. But most importantly, the most cases that bring sadness is when this guy comes to the United States from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from wherever, Qatar. He marries an American woman, and he gives her a rosy picture about Islam, that she's going to live in heaven, she's going to have money, she's going to have everything. We respect her religion. She doesn't have to change her religion. And then when she has kids, and I had many, many cases, when she had kids, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, all of a sudden he wants to go to Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Lebanon so that the family would see his kids. And once the kids are moved to that country, you would never see them back. We were unable to get even a visa from the Saudi embassy for the poor woman to see her 3 children who moved them to Saudi Arabia. You couldn't get a visa for her to visit her children. And so at least in other countries like Lebanon and Jordan, they would allow the woman to go visit her children, but in Saudi Arabia, you cannot. So Islam is very, very difficult religion. We knew it in the Middle East. It's not only affecting the Christians, like all of us who came from the Middle East, it's affecting international law. By international law, I mean these resolutions that were issued by the United Nations, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Now, this international law was adopted in 1979 by the United Nations General Assembly. Every single country in the Middle East ratified this treaty. They signed on it. But what they don't tell you, that upon ratification, they would add a reservation, they would enter a reservation that says, everything in this conference or in this treaty that violates our Islamic Sharia, we don't recognize it. So, for example, the woman, this declaration gives the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, give women the freedom of choice, the freedom to vote, the freedom of religion, freedom of marriage. Now, all of these things violate Islamic Sharia because under the rules of Islamic law, a Muslim woman cannot marry a non-Muslim man, and therefore they entered all these reservations. Every single Muslim nation on earth entered this reservation. We have also the rights for the child. The right for the child means the child has the right for education, the right to have his religion, the right. All these freedoms that we know are embedded in the right of the child. Again, every single Muslim nation agreed to this, with the exception, with a reservation that says any provision in this treaty that violates Islamic law is nullified. We don't recognize it. And so we have 2 types of international law. We have the international law that everybody abides by, and then we have another set of international law that applies only to Muslims. So we're talking about how do we uninstitutionalize these things. I don't think it's going to work in the Middle East. I mean, this is entrenched in every single soul in the Middle East. Now, you could say we are going to change the constitutions. As you know, every single constitution except Lebanon states that the religion of the state is Islam, and that Islamic Sharia is the source of legislation. How could you change that in the Middle East? What king or what president can go to the Congress over there, the parliament, and tell them, I want you to change this? I don't think this is going to work. And this is the reason why you see this influx of immigrants coming from that part of the world to the United States. This is a big problem. I don't see any solution for that problem, but I agree with the recommendation, Dr. Prodromou, on these things. I don't know how we could work it out. There has to be a concerted effort by the American people, Muslims and Christians, to change the rules in the Middle East. Otherwise, there is no cure for that. Thank you very much, guys.